The accusation came like a thunderclap on a clear day, and Katherine Brennan knew her world had just shattered into 1,000 pieces when Mayor Holbrook pointed his fat finger at her across the general store and shouted that she was a thief who deserved to hang. Georgetown, Colorado had been her home for 2 years now, ever since she'd fled the memories of her dead parents in Kansas and come west to start fresh in the mining town nestled high in the Rocky Mountains. The year was 1878, and Katherine had worked hard to build a respectable life for herself as a seamstress, mending miners' clothes and sewing dresses for the wives of the more prosperous men who'd struck silver in the surrounding hills. She lived in a modest room above the bakery, kept to herself mostly, and tried not to think about how lonely the mountain nights could be when the wind howled through the passes and reminded her that she was truly alone in this world. But now, standing in Patterson's general store with a bolt of blue calico clutched in her trembling hands, Katherine found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Mayor Holbrook's face was purple with rage, and behind him stood his wife Eleanor, her thin lips pressed into a line of smug satisfaction. "That brooch you are wearing," the mayor bellowed, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded store, "that belonged to my wife. It was stolen from our home 3 nights ago, and here you are, bold as brass, wearing stolen property for all the world to see." Katherine's hand flew to her chest, where the delicate silver brooch in the shape of a bird was pinned to her collar. Her fingers touched the cool metal and her heart sank. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "She gave it to me before she died. I have worn it nearly every day since." "Liar," Eleanor Holbrook shrieked, pushing past her husband. "That is mine. I had it specially made in Denver last year. There cannot be two exactly alike. You broke into our home and stole it, you little thief." The crowd in the store had gone silent, and Katherine could feel every eye upon her. She recognized the faces around her missus. Patterson behind the counter, old Tom Murphy who ran the livery stable, the Hanson brothers who worked claims up in the hills, Sarah Chen who did washing for half the town. These were people she'd served, people she'd smiled at on the street, people she'd thought were becoming something like neighbors if not quite friends. "I did not steal anything," Katherine said, lifting her chin even as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. "This brooch belonged to my mother, Marion Brennan. She received it from her own mother on her wedding day. I can prove it." "How?" Mayor Holbrook demanded. "By showing us some convenient papers that you have conveniently kept all these years, papers that could be easily forged." "I have a photograph," Katherine insisted. "In my room, my mother is wearing this very brooch in a portrait taken before I was born. The photographer's mark is on the back. Samuel Hayes of Lawrence, Kansas, dated 1852. Eleanor Holbrook's eyes narrowed. "Then you stole the brooch from someone in Kansas and invented this story. That changes nothing. I tell you, this is my property, stolen from my home, and I demand justice." "Where were you 3 nights ago?" the mayor asked, crossing his arms over his considerable belly. "Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts?" Katherine's mind raced. 3 nights ago had been Saturday. She'd finished her sewing early and spent the evening alone in her room, reading by lamplight. "I was in my room," she said. "Alone." "How convenient," Eleanor said with a cold smile. "No alibi whatsoever." "This is ridiculous," Katherine protested, but she could see the doubt creeping into the faces around her. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, being alone with no one to vouch for you was almost as good as a confession. "Why would I steal something and then wear it openly if I were a thief? That makes no sense." "The arrogance of criminals knows no bounds," Mayor Holbrook declared. "You probably thought yourself so clever that no one would notice. Or perhaps You are simply too stupid to realize you would be caught. Either way, Sheriff Dawson will be summoned, and you will be arrested and tried for theft. On what evidence? A new voice cut through the crowd, deep and steady. I heard nothing but accusations and coincidence so far. Katherine turned to see a tall man stepping forward from where he'd been standing near the feed sacks at the back of the store. She recognized him vaguely, one of the cowboys who worked at the Running R Ranch about 5 miles outside of town. He came into Georgetown maybe once or twice a month for supplies, always polite but never overly friendly. She'd noticed him before because he was hard not to notice, with shoulders that filled out his worn shirt and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. She thought his name was Frank something. "This is none of your concern, Rawlins," Mayor Holbrook said dismissively. "Return to your cattle and leave town business to townspeople." So his name was Rawlins, Frank Rawlins. Katherine watched as he moved closer, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains, and right now they were fixed on the mayor with an intensity that made the older man shift his weight uncomfortably. "I am making it my concern," Frank said quietly. "You are accusing a woman of a crime without a shred of proof. You say the brooch is yours, Mrs. Holbrook, but Miss Brennan says it belonged to her mother. Do you have proof of purchase? A receipt from the jeweler in Denver?" Eleanor Holbrook's face flushed. "I do not need to prove my ownership of my own property. The fact that this girl has it is proof enough that she stole it." "That is not how the law works," Frank said. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "If you are going to accuse someone of theft, you need evidence. Real evidence, not just your word against hers." "The evidence is hanging right there on her chest," the mayor sputtered. "What more do you need?" "Miss Brennan has offered to show you a photograph of her mother wearing the same brooch," Frank pointed out. "That seems like a reasonable place to start. Have you offered any such proof of your ownership?" Katherine stared at this man, this cowboy she barely knew, who was standing up for her against the most powerful man in town. Her throat felt tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. No one had defended her in so long. Not since her father had died 5 years ago, leaving her mother struggling and sick. Not since her mother had followed her father to the grave 2 years later, leaving Katherine completely alone. She'd learned to fight her own battles, to stand on her own feet, to expect nothing from anyone because expecting nothing meant never being disappointed. But here was Frank Rawlins, risking the mayor's anger for a woman he didn't even know. "This is preposterous," Eleanor Holbrook hissed. "Harold, are you going to let this ranch hand tell you what to do?" The mayor's face darkened. "Now see here, Rawlins. I appreciate that you think you are being chivalrous, but you are interfering with justice. The sheriff will sort this out, and if you continue to obstruct—" "I am not obstructing anything," Frank interrupted. "I am simply pointing out that you are rushing to judgment without evidence. If you want to summon the sheriff, fine. But I will stand for Miss Brennan in court if this goes to trial. I will ensure she gets a fair hearing and that actual evidence is presented, not just the word of someone who wants to see her hang." The store erupted in murmurs. Katherine felt dizzy. Stand for her in court. He didn't even know her. Why would he do such a thing? "You would defend a thief?" the mayor asked incredulously. "I would defend an innocent woman being railroaded by people who should know better," Frank said. His eyes met Katherine's for just a moment, and she saw something there: determination, yes, but also a gentleness that made her chest ache. Everyone deserves a fair chance to prove their innocence. "This is madness," Eleanor Holbrook said, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice now. "Harold, do something." Mayor Holbrook looked around the store, seeming to realize for the first time that the crowd's sympathies might be shifting. Tom Murphy was nodding slowly, and Sarah Chen had moved closer to Katherine in what might have been a gesture of support. "Fine," the mayor said at last. "We will let the sheriff handle this. But mark my words, Rawlins, you are making a grave mistake tying yourself to this woman. When the truth comes out, do not expect anyone to forget that you defended a criminal." "I will take my chances," Frank said evenly. Sheriff Dawson arrived 20 minutes later, a weathered man in his 50s with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. He listened to both sides of the story, examined the brooch with careful attention, and finally announced that Katherine would not be arrested immediately, but that she was not to leave town while he investigated the matter. "I will speak to both parties separately," he said, directing a stern look at the mayor and his wife. "And I will want to see that photograph Miss Brennan mentioned, as well as any documentation you might have regarding your brooch, Mrs. Holbrook. We will get to the bottom of this, but we will do it properly." Katherine felt a wave of relief so intense it left her shaking. Not arrested, not thrown in jail. She had time to prove her innocence. As the crowd began to disperse, Frank Rawlins appeared at her elbow. Up close, he was even more striking, strong jaw shadowed with a day's worth of stubble, those remarkable eyes, a small scar on his left cheekbone that spoke of a hard life. He had to be about 26 or 27, she guessed. Maybe 6 or 7 years older than her own 20 years. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice still unsteady. "I do not understand why you did that, but thank you. You looked like you needed someone on your side," he said simply. "And I meant what I said. If this goes to trial, I will stand with you. I know Judge Harrison, who rides the circuit through here. He is a fair man, but you will need someone who can speak for your character." "You do not know my character," Katherine pointed out. "For all you know, I might actually be a thief." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and Katherine felt something flutter in her stomach. "I watched you once spend 20 minutes helping old Mrs. Patterson pick up spilled buttons after her jar broke," he said. "You were gentle with her, patient. A real thief would have hurried past, not wanting to be noticed. And I have seen the way you work, precise, careful, taking pride in every stitch. That is not the behavior of someone who takes what does not belong to them." Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You noticed all that?" "I notice a lot of things," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her pulse quicken. "Come on, let me walk you home. You have had enough public scrutiny for one day." They walked through the dusty streets of Georgetown in the afternoon sunlight, the mountains rising sharp and beautiful on all sides. The town sat at nearly 8,500 feet, high enough that the air was thin and clear, and the summers were brief. It was late June now, and the wildflowers were blooming in impossible colors across the mountain meadows. Katherine had always loved this town, loved the way it felt like being on top of the world, loved the mixed community of miners and merchants and cowboys and Chinese immigrants who'd stayed after the railroad work dried up. She'd felt safe here, anonymous enough to start over but small enough to eventually feel like she belonged. Now that safety felt shattered. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked as they walked. "People will talk. The mayor will make your life difficult." Frank shrugged. "Let them talk. As for the mayor, he has no power over me. I work for Jack Robinson at the Running R, and Jack does not bow to anyone, least of all a blowhard like Holbrook. Besides," he added, glancing at her, "I have a sister back in Texas. She is about your age. If she were in trouble and needed someone to stand up for her, I would hope some stranger would have the decency to help." "Where in Texas?" Katherine asked, grateful for the change of subject. "San Antonio originally, but that was a long time ago. I have been drifting for the better part of 10 years, cowboying, mostly." Did some cattle drives up from Texas to Kansas, worked ranches in New Mexico and Wyoming, ended up here last year and decided to stay for a while. The mountains suit me. They reached the bakery, and Katherine paused at the exterior stairs that led up to her room. The smell of fresh bread drifted from below, familiar and comforting. "Would you like to see the photograph?" she asked. "The one of my mother. I know the sheriff will want to see it, but I thought perhaps you might like to know for certain that I am telling the truth." "I already know you are telling the truth," Frank said. "But yes, I would like to see it, if you do not mind the company." Her room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a trunk that held her few possessions, and a table near the window where she did her sewing. Katherine pulled the trunk open and carefully removed a wooden box from the bottom, beneath her winter clothes. Inside the box were her treasured letters from her parents, her mother's wedding ring, a pressed flower from her father's funeral, and the photograph. She handed it to Frank with trembling fingers. The image was faded but clear enough. A young woman with dark hair and Katherine's eyes, wearing a simple dress with the bird brooch pinned at her collar. On the back, just as she'd said, was the photographer's mark. Frank studied it for a long moment. "She was beautiful," he said softly. "You look like her." "Everyone said so," Katherine replied, her voice catching. "She was so kind, so patient. After my father died, she worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep us fed. When she got sick, there was no money for a doctor. I was only 18 when she passed. I felt so lost." "That is why you came here," Frank said. "It was not a question. I could not stay in that house with all those memories. I sold everything, packed what would fit in one trunk, and bought a ticket on the first stage heading west. I chose Georgetown because it sounded solid, like a place where a person could put down roots." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I suppose I was wrong about that." "You were not wrong," Frank said firmly. He handed the photograph back to her, and their fingers brushed. The contact sent a jolt through Katherine that she tried to ignore. "Most people in this town are good. The Holbrooks are not most people. The mayor is a bully who uses his position to push people around, and his wife is a petty woman who enjoys making others miserable. But they are not Georgetown. The rest of us are." "Why do you care so much?" Katherine asked, meeting his eyes. "Please tell me the truth." Frank was silent for a moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "When I was younger, I saw a man accused of stealing horses. There was a mob, and they were ready to hang him without a trial. He kept saying he was innocent, but no one would listen. They strung him up from an oak tree, and 3 days later they found the real horse thief 2 counties over. The man they hanged left behind a wife and 2 small children." He looked away, his jaw tight. "I was only 17, and I was too scared to speak up. I have regretted that silence every day since. So when I saw you standing there and I saw that same mob mentality starting to form, I decided I would not be silent this time." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "I am sorry you saw that," she whispered. "I am sorry it happened," Frank said. "But maybe some good can come from it if it means I am willing to fight for what is right now. Which brings me to a practical matter. Do you have money for a lawyer if this goes to trial?" Katherine shook her head. "I have a little saved, but not enough for that." "Then we will figure it out together," Frank said. "In the meantime, stay calm and stay visible. Go about your business as normally as you can. The more people see you acting like an innocent woman with nothing to hide, the harder it will be for the Holbrooks to paint you as a criminal." He left shortly after, tipping his hat to her with a small smile that did strange things to her composure. Katherine watched him walk back down the street toward the general store, his stride long and easy, and wondered what she had done to deserve such an unexpected ally. The next few days were torture. Sheriff Dawson came by to examine the photograph and took notes on her story. He was professional but non-committal, giving Katherine no hint of what he believed. Meanwhile, Mayor Holbrook apparently spread her version of events to anyone who would listen, and Katherine found herself the subject of whispers and stares wherever she went. Some people were kind. Sarah Chen stopped by with a basket of vegetables from her garden and a fierce declaration that she did not believe a word of the accusations. Mrs. Patterson offered Katherine a discount on fabric, saying quietly that she knew honest work when she saw it. But others crossed the street to avoid her, and two of her regular sewing customers sent word that they would be taking their business elsewhere. Frank appeared each evening just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains. The first night, he brought her a meat pie from the hotel restaurant, saying he had noticed she looked too thin and could use a good meal. The second night, he simply sat with her on the steps outside the bakery and talked about ranch life, about the cattle they were moving to higher pastures for the summer grazing, about the way the sunrise looked from horseback in the high meadows. The third night, he taught her to play poker with a battered deck of cards, and Katherine laughed for the first time since the accusation, feeling something loosen in her chest. "You are terrible at bluffing," Frank told her with a grin as he won another hand. "Your face shows everything you are thinking." "Then it is a good thing I am not a gambler," Katherine said. "My mother always said I wore my heart on my sleeve." "That is not a bad thing," Frank said, his voice gentler. "The world needs more honest people, not fewer." On the fourth day, Sheriff Dawson requested a meeting at his office. Katherine's stomach churned with anxiety as she walked through town, very aware of the eyes tracking her progress. Frank met her on the steps of the sheriff's office, having somehow known she would need moral support. "Whatever happens, we will deal with it," he said, holding the door open for her. Inside, they found not just the sheriff but also Mayor and Mrs. Holbrook. Eleanor looked smug while her husband appeared uncomfortable. Sheriff Dawson gestured for everyone to sit. "I have completed my investigation," the sheriff began, his tone neutral. "And I have to say, this is one of the more interesting cases I have encountered. Mrs. Holbrook, you claim that your brooch was stolen 4 nights ago from your home. You say you placed it on your dresser before retiring, and when you woke, it was gone." "That is correct," Eleanor said primly. "And you, Miss Brennan, claim that the brooch you wear belonged to your mother and has been in your possession for years." "Yes," Katherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have the photograph showing my mother wearing it in 1852. "I have seen the photograph," the sheriff acknowledged. "I also sent a telegram to Lawrence, Kansas, to the successor of Samuel Hayes's photography studio. They confirmed that Hayes did work in the area in 1852 and that the mark on the photograph is genuine. They had no records that far back, of course, but they had no reason to doubt the authenticity." Katherine felt a flicker of hope. Beside her, Frank shifted slightly closer, a silent show of support. "However," Sheriff Dawson continued, "Mrs. Holbrook also provided documentation. She has a receipt from a jeweler in Denver, dated 8 months ago, for a silver brooch in the shape of a bird." He pulled out a piece of paper and laid it on the desk. "The description matches the brooch in question quite closely." Katherine's heart sank. "But that is impossible. I have had my mother's brooch for—" "Let me finish," the sheriff interrupted. "This is where things get interesting. I took the liberty of sending another telegram, this time to the jeweler in Denver. I wanted to know if he had made 2 similar brooches or if perhaps he had copied an older design." He paused, looking directly at Eleanor Holbrook. "The jeweler was very helpful. He informed me that he did indeed create a brooch 8 months ago for a Mrs. Holbrook of Georgetown. However, he also mentioned that Mrs. Holbrook had brought him an old brooch to use as a model. She wanted him to make an exact copy because she admired the original so much. The jeweler asked if she wanted him to repair the original while he was at it, but Mrs. Holbrook said no, she wanted to keep the old one as it was. The room went very still. Catherine's mind raced, trying to understand what this meant. "I do not understand what you are implying," Mayor Holbrook said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I am implying nothing," Sheriff Dawson said coolly. "I am stating facts. Mrs. Holbrook, you commissioned a copy of an antique brooch. The question is, where is your copy and where is the original you used as a model?" Alina's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. This is, you have no right to accuse me. I am not accusing you of anything yet," the sheriff said. "I am asking you a question. Where is the brooch you purchased in Denver?" "It was stolen," Alina insisted, but her voice had risen to a near shriek. "That is what I have been saying all along. This girl stole it from my home." "Actually," the sheriff said mildly, "you have been claiming that Miss Brennan was wearing your stolen brooch. But if your brooch is a copy and Miss Brennan's is the original, then the brooch she is wearing cannot be yours, can it?" "That is ridiculous legal sophistry," Mayor Holbrook blustered. "Obviously, my wife—" "Your wife what?" Frank asked quietly, speaking for the first time. "Made a copy of a brooch that did not belong to her. Where did she get the original to use as a model, Mayor?" The silence that followed was deafening. Katherine watched as understanding slowly dawned on Alina Holbrook's face, the understanding that she had been caught in her own trap. "This is an outrage," Alina said, but her voice shook. "I will not sit here and be interrogated like a common criminal." "Then perhaps you would prefer to explain yourself," Sheriff Dawson suggested. "Because from where I sit, it appears that you somehow acquired Miss Brennan's brooch, had a copy made, and then tried to claim the original was yours when you saw her wearing it. The only question is how you got the brooch in the first place." Catherine's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt, trying to process what was happening. "I keep my brooch in a drawer when I am not wearing it," she said slowly. "In my room above the bakery. But I had stopped wearing it every day because the pin was getting loose. I took it to Mr. Chen about a year ago to have it repaired, and he said he needed to order a stronger pin mechanism from Denver. It took 3 months for the part to arrive, and I only got the brooch back about 9 months ago. Mr. Chen does metalwork and repairs," Sheriff Dawson said, nodding. "I am aware." "What if," Frank said, his voice hard now, "someone saw the brooch when Mr. Chen had it in his shop? What if that someone admired it enough to have a copy made but decided that was not enough? What if that someone wanted the original? How dare you?" Alina shrieked, leaping to her feet. "You have no proof of any such thing. Harold, are you going to let them slander me this way?" But Mayor Holbrook was staring at his wife with something like horror in his eyes. "Alina," he said slowly, "you told me you had the brooch designed especially for you. You said it was a unique piece." "It is," Alina insisted. "But the jeweler said you brought him an original to copy," the sheriff pointed out. "So which is it, Mrs. Holbrook? Did you design it yourself, or did you copy someone else's brooch?" It was inspired by a brooch I saw, that is all. There is nothing wrong with that." "There is if you stole the original," Frank said bluntly. "I did not steal anything." Alina's voice had reached a pitch that made Katherine wince. "This is persecution. You are all conspiring against me, Mrs. Holbrook," Sheriff Dawson said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I am going to ask you one more time. Where did you get the original brooch that you used as a model for your copy?" For a long moment, Katherine thought Alina might brazen it out, might continue to lie and deny until there was nothing anyone could prove. But something in the woman's face crumbled, and suddenly she looked smaller, older, diminished. "I saw it in Mr. Chen's shop," she whispered. "It was so beautiful, and I have always admired fine jewelry, and Harold never buys me anything nice anymore. I just wanted to look at it, so I asked Mr. Chen if I could examine it more closely. He was busy with another customer, so he said yes and turned away. I only meant to borrow it for a few days, just to have a copy made. But when I got it back from the jeweler, I could not bring myself to return it. It was so lovely, and I thought no one would ever know. I thought Miss Brennan would assume she had misplaced it, or that it had been lost during the repair. I never imagined she would have a photograph showing it belonged to her mother." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Katherine felt oddly detached, as though she were watching this scene happen to someone else. All this time, her mother's brooch, one of her most precious possessions, had been sitting in Mayor Holbrook's jewelry box, while Katherine had worn the copy without even knowing it. "You let me be accused of theft," Katherine said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent room. "You tried to have me arrested, tried to turn the whole town against me, and all along, you were the thief. You stole from me and then tried to destroy my reputation to cover your own crime." "I did not mean for it to go this far," Eleanor said, but there was no true remorse in her voice, only self-pity. "When I saw you wearing the brooch, I panicked. I thought if I accused you first, no one would question me." "Except someone did question you," Frank said, his voice cold with contempt. "And now everyone knows the truth." Mayor Holbrook had gone very pale. "Eleanor, you realize what you have done, the damage to our reputation, my position." "Your position?" Katherine asked incredulously. "Your wife tried to have me arrested for a crime she committed, and you are worried about your reputation." "Miss Brennan is right," Sheriff Dawson said. "Mrs. Holbrook, by your own admission, you stole Miss Brennan's brooch and then attempted to frame her for theft. Those are serious crimes. I am placing you under arrest." The next few minutes were chaos. Eleanor wept and pleaded, Mayor Holbrook blustered and threatened, and Sheriff Dawson remained implacable, leading Eleanor away to a cell in the back of his office. Katherine sat frozen in her chair, unable to quite believe it was over. "Miss Brennan," the sheriff said, returning to the front office, "I will need you to identify which brooch is the original and which is the copy. Mrs. Holbrook will be required to return your property." "Of course," Katherine managed. "Though I have been wearing the copy, so I suppose I need to examine both carefully." "We will arrange that," the sheriff assured her. "And Miss Brennan, I apologize that you were put through this ordeal. You should never have been accused without evidence." After they left the sheriff's office, Frank guided Katherine to a quiet bench beside the church, away from the main street. She sat down heavily, her legs suddenly weak, and tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. "I cannot believe it," she said. "I wore that brooch for months, never knowing it was not the real one. And all that time, Eleanor Holbrook had my mother's actual brooch, and she was planning to what was she planning? To keep it forever. People do not always think their schemes through," Frank said, sitting beside her. "She wanted something beautiful, and she took it without thought for the consequences. And when those consequences came calling, she tried to blame you rather than admit what she had done." "If you had not spoken up," Katherine said, turning to look at him, "I might be in jail right now, or worse." The sheriff might have believed her story over mine. "Everyone knows the Holbrooks have money and influence. I am just a seamstress with no family and no powerful friends." "You have a friend now," Frank said quietly, "if you want one." Something in his tone made Katherine's breath catch. She studied his face, the strong features, the steady eyes, the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than just a charity case or a cause to champion. "I would like that very much," she said softly, "though I fear you may have made an enemy of the mayor." "The mayor can choke on his own bile for all I care," Frank said bluntly, and Katherine surprised herself by laughing. "That is a terrible thing to say, but satisfying." He grinned at her, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. "Come on, let me buy you dinner at the hotel. We should celebrate your vindication." They ate fried chicken and potatoes while the dining room buzzed with news of Mayor Holbrook's arrest. People kept stopping by their table to offer Katherine congratulations and apologies, and she accepted both with as much grace as she could muster. Across from her, Frank seemed perfectly at ease, deflecting attention with jokes and easy conversation, giving her space to breathe. When they finally left the hotel, the sun had set, and the mountain sky was blazing with stars. The air was cool and thin, scented with pine and the distant promise of snow from the high peaks. Frank walked Katherine back to the bakery, and they lingered on the steps, neither quite ready to say good night. "I still do not understand why you did this," Katherine said. "Why you risked so much for a stranger." "You are not a stranger anymore," Frank pointed out. "And as for why I told you about the man who was hanged, but there is more to it than that. I suppose I have spent most of my life drifting, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots or make real connections. It is easier that way. You cannot lose people if you never let yourself care about them in the first place, but it is also lonely." He looked up at the stars, his profile clean and strong in the moonlight. "When I saw you in that store standing alone against all those accusations, something in me recognized something in you. Maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the courage, but I knew I could not walk away." Katherine's heart was beating very fast. "I am glad you did not walk away," she whispered. He looked at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel as though she might catch fire. "Can I be honest with you about something?" he asked. "Please. I have noticed you for months. Every time I came into town, I looked for you. I made excuses to walk past the bakery, hoping I might catch a glimpse of you in the window. I knew your name because I asked around, trying to sound casual about it. When I saw you being accused, yes, I was motivated by a sense of justice and the memory of past regrets. But I was also terrified. Terrified that you might actually be guilty, that I had been wrong about you, that the woman I had been half in love with from a distance might be someone other than who I thought." Katherine could barely breathe. "Half in love," she repeated. "More than half, if I am being truly honest," Frank said. "I know it is too fast, too presumptuous. We barely know each other. But I have never been good at hiding what I feel, and I do not want to start now. You can tell me to go, and I will. Or you can give me a chance to prove that what I feel is real and worth your time." For a moment, Katherine could not speak. She thought about all the months of loneliness, all the nights she had lain awake wishing for someone who might understand her, might see her not as a charity case or a burden but as a person worth knowing. And here was this man, this unexpected, wonderful man, offering her exactly that. "I would like you to stay," she said. "I would like very much for you to stay." The smile that broke across Frank's face was like sunrise over the mountains. "Then I will stay," he said, "for as long as you will have me." He did not kiss her that night, though Katherine thought he might have wanted to. Instead, he took her hand and held it gently, his calloused thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that felt more intimate than any embrace. They stood there in the moonlight, two people who had been alone finding unexpected solace in each other, and Katherine felt something shift inside her. The fear and anger of the past days began to drain away, replaced by something fragile and precious: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of gossip and scandal. Mayor Holbrook was tried for theft and fraud, and the judge, the same Judge Harrison that Frank had mentioned, sentenced her to 6 months in jail and a substantial fine. Mayor Holbrook resigned in disgrace, and there was talk of a special election to replace him. The whole town seemed to be gossiping about nothing else, and Katherine found herself an unlikely celebrity, the wronged innocent who had been vindicated by justice. She tried not to think about it too much. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her sewing business, which had suffered during the scandal, but was now thriving as customers returned with sheepish apologies and new orders. She worked long hours at her table by the window, her fingers moving steadily through fabric and thread, creating beauty from raw materials. And every evening, Frank came to see her. Sometimes they walked through town, greeting neighbors and enjoying the cool mountain air. Sometimes they sat on the bakery steps and talked about everything and nothing: his childhood in Texas, her memories of Kansas, their dreams for the future. Sometimes Frank brought his guitar and played old songs while Katherine listened, enchanted by the rough warmth of his voice. On Sunday mornings, they attended church together, and Katherine tried not to notice the knowing looks and whispered comments from the other parishioners. It was clear that everyone in Georgetown had decided that Frank Rawlins and Katherine Brennan were courting, and for once, Katherine did not mind being the subject of town gossip. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in years. One Saturday in late July, Frank borrowed a buggy from the ranch and took Katherine on a picnic up into the high country. They drove for miles along narrow roads that wound through forests of aspen and pine, climbing higher and higher, until they emerged into an alpine meadow so beautiful it made Katherine's chest ache. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in impossible colors: purple lupine, yellow arnica, red paintbrush, blue columbine. A creek ran through the center of the meadow, its water ice-cold and crystal clear, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. "This is my favorite place in all of Colorado," Frank said as he helped Katherine down from the buggy. "I come up here sometimes when I need to think or when the world feels too heavy. It reminds me that there is still beauty in the world, still places untouched by human cruelty and pettiness." They spread a blanket near the creek and ate the lunch Katherine had packed: bread and cheese and cold chicken, with apple pie for dessert. Afterward, they lay on their backs and watched clouds drift across the achingly blue sky, and Frank told her stories about the constellations he could see at night from this meadow. "You ever want to go back to Texas?" Katherine asked. "To see your sister?" "Sometimes," Frank admitted. "But Maria married a good man a few years back, and they are happy in San Antonio. She writes to me occasionally, telling me about her children and her life. I think she understands why I needed to leave. After our father died, there was nothing keeping me there except obligation, and Maria never wanted me to stay out of obligation. What happened to your father? Kicked by a horse when I was 19. He lingered for a few days, but there was nothing the doctor could do. After he died, I tried to run the ranch for a while, but my heart was not in it. I sold it and split the money with Maria, then headed north. I have been moving ever since." "Until you came to Georgetown," Katherine said. "Until I came to Georgetown," Frank agreed. He turned his head to look at her, and his expression was serious. "I told Jack Robinson that I would stay through the winter, but that was before I met you. Now I think I might stay longer than that, if you want me to." Katherine's heart was pounding. "I want you to," she whispered. "I want you to stay as long as you can, forever if possible." "Forever is a long time," Frank said softly. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "But I think I would like to try for forever with you." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, Katherine met him halfway. His lips were warm and soft against hers, and the kiss was everything she had dreamed of and more: tender and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine was breathless, her cheeks flushed and her heart racing. "I love you," Frank said, the words simple and direct. "I know it has only been a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Katherine Brennan, and I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Tears pricked Katherine's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she said. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stood up for me in that store. No one has ever fought for me the way you did. No one has ever made me feel the way you make me feel, like I matter, like I am worth something. You are worth everything," Frank said fiercely. "Never doubt that." They stayed in the meadow until the shadows grew long and the air turned cool, reluctant to leave their private paradise. On the drive back to town, Frank held Katherine's hand and they made plans in soft voices. Plans for a future that suddenly seemed possible, even probable. Katherine had never been one to dream too big, afraid of disappointment, but with Frank beside her, she allowed herself to imagine a life full of joy and love and belonging. In August, Frank asked Katherine to marry him, and she said yes without hesitation. They were married in September in the little church in Georgetown, with half the town in attendance. Sarah Chen helped Katherine sew her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. The original brooch, returned to her by Sheriff Dawson, was pinned at her throat, a symbol of everything she had survived and everything she had gained. Jack Robinson gave Frank time off from the ranch for a brief honeymoon, and they spent a week in Denver, staying in a modest hotel and exploring the growing city together. They visited museums and theaters, ate in restaurants, and wandered through parks, marveling at how different city life was from the mountain town they called home. But as wonderful as Denver was, both of them were relieved to return to Georgetown, to the thin mountain air and the familiar faces and the life they were building together. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a two-room cabin that needed work but had good bones and a stunning view of the mountains. Frank spent his days off from the ranch making repairs, patching the roof, fixing the crooked door, building Katherine a proper sewing table by the window. Katherine continued her seamstress work, and between her income and Frank's wages from the running they managed to save a little money each month. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Frank would leave before dawn to ride out to the ranch, and Katherine would spend her days sewing, taking breaks to chat with neighbors or shop for supplies. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together in their tiny kitchen, talking and laughing and planning for the future. After dark, they would sit on their porch and watch the stars come out, Frank's arm around Katherine's shoulders, both of them marveling at the simple miracle of having found each other. Winter came early to the high country that year, with the first snow falling in late October. The town settled in for the long, cold months, the mines operating on reduced schedules, the ranchers moving their cattle to lower elevations or into barns for shelter. Frank's work at the running became more about maintenance than herding, repairing fences, feeding livestock, keeping buildings from collapsing under the weight of heavy snow. Katherine learned to cope with the fierce mountain winters, something she had not quite managed during her first 2 years in Georgetown. But everything was different now. She was not alone anymore, trying to stay warm in a drafty room above the bakery. She had Frank, and she had their little house, and she had the knowledge that someone would be coming home to her every night, no matter how hard the wind blew or how deep the snow fell. In January, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She told Frank on a cold night when the northern lights were dancing green and purple across the sky, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy and wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel cherished beyond measure. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "You and me, Katherine, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Frank said, pulling her close. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I cannot even put it into words. You have given me everything I never knew I needed: a home, a purpose, a future. And now a child. How did I get so lucky?" "I am the lucky one," Katherine insisted. But Frank just kissed her and told her they could argue about who was luckier after the baby was born. The pregnancy was not easy. Katherine suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon. And as spring arrived and turned to summer, the heat made her swell and ache. But Frank was endlessly patient, bringing her cool water and rubbing her feet and reading to her when she was too tired to do anything but lie in bed. The women of Georgetown rallied around her, as well. Sarah Chen brought herbal teas to help with the nausea. Mrs. Patterson knitted tiny blankets and caps, and even old Tom Murphy carved a wooden rattle that made Katherine cry with its simple sweetness. Their son was born on a warm night in early September, exactly 1 year after Katherine and Frank's wedding. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Frank, pacing outside the bedroom while the midwife worked, thought he might lose his mind with worry. But Katherine was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and when the baby's first cry split the night air, Frank felt his knees go weak with relief. The midwife let him in a few minutes later, and Frank approached the bed with trembling hands. Katherine looked exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her smile brighter than the sun. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling. "Meet your son," Katherine said softly. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything that felt quite right. But looking down at his son Frank suddenly knew. "Thomas," he said. "After Tom Murphy, who has been kind to both of us, and James for my father, Thomas James Rawlins." "Thomas James," Katherine repeated, testing the sound of it. "I love it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, little one." Thomas was a good baby, as babies went. He cried when he was hungry or wet, but settled quickly when his needs were met. Frank discovered a talent for soothing him in the middle of the night, walking the floor with his son against his shoulder, humming old cowboy songs, until Thomas's eyes grew heavy and he drifted back to sleep. Katherine watched them sometimes from the bed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely perfect. Frank reduced his hours at the ranch, and Jack Robinson, who had become a good friend over the years, was understanding and supportive. Katherine's sewing business slowed to a trickle as she focused on motherhood, but she did not mind. There would be time enough to work when Thomas was older. For now, she wanted to soak in every moment of his babyhood, knowing how quickly time would pass. The town of Georgetown embraced Thomas as one of their own. He was, after all, the child of local celebrities, the seamstress who had been falsely accused, and the cowboy who had defended her. People stopped Katherine on the street to admire the baby, and Thomas was passed around like a precious parcel at church gatherings and town socials. When Thomas was 6 months old, they received a letter from Frank's sister Maria in Texas. She had heard through Frank's occasional letters about his marriage and new son, and she was desperate to meet Katherine and Thomas. Would they consider a visit to San Antonio? Frank and Katherine talked it over and decided they could manage a trip in the spring, when Thomas would be a bit older and the traveling easier. They saved every spare penny they could, and when April arrived with its promise of warmer weather, they packed their bags and boarded a stage heading south. The journey took weeks and was harder than Katherine had anticipated. Thomas was fussy in the cramped confines of the stagecoach, and there were nights when they had to make do with questionable lodgings and mediocre food. But Frank was an experienced traveler, and he managed to keep them all in good spirits with his jokes and stories and endless patience. San Antonio was a revelation. Katherine had never seen a city quite so vibrant, so full of life and color and noise. The missions were beautiful, the river walk was enchanting, and the blend of Mexican and American cultures created an atmosphere unlike anything she had experienced in Colorado. Maria proved to be as warm and welcoming as her brother had promised. She was a petite woman with Frank's eyes and a laugh that seemed to fill every room she entered. Her husband Carlos was a blacksmith with gentle hands and a kind smile, and their 3 children ranging from 7 to 3 years old were delighted to have a baby cousin to fuss over. They stayed with Maria's family for 2 weeks, and Katherine fell in love with the bustling household, so different from her quiet mountain life. There was always someone talking, always children laughing or arguing, always food cooking and laundry hanging and life happening in every corner. It was chaotic and loud and wonderful. "You are good for my brother," Maria told Katherine one evening while they were washing dishes together. The men were outside with the children, and Thomas was napping in a basket nearby. "I have never seen Frank so settled, so content. He spent so many years running from one place to another, never letting himself be happy. But he is happy with you. I can see it in his eyes." "He makes me happy too," Katherine said. "I did not think I would ever find someone who understood me, who accepted me as I am, but Frank does. He sees all of me, the broken parts and the strong parts, and he loves me anyway." "That is what marriage should be," Maria said, smiling. "Not perfection, but partnership. Not hiding your flaws, but finding someone who loves you because of them, not despite them." The visit ended too soon, and saying goodbye to Maria and her family was harder than Katherine had expected. But they promised to write often and to visit again when they could, and Frank assured his sister that she and her family would always be welcome in Colorado. The journey back to Georgetown felt shorter, perhaps because they knew what to expect, or perhaps because they were eager to return home. When they finally crested the last ridge and saw their little town spread out below them, nestled in the mountains like a jewel in a setting, Katherine felt a surge of love for the place that had given her so much pain and so much joy. "Home," Frank said, echoing her thoughts. He reached over and took her hand, Thomas asleep in her lap. "Thank you for coming with me to Texas. I know it was not easy." "It was worth it," Katherine said. "Maria is wonderful, and I am glad Thomas got to meet his aunt and uncle and cousins, but I am also glad to be going home. This is where we belong." They settled back into their routine, and the years began to pass with a comfortable rhythm. Thomas grew from a baby into a curious toddler, then into a bright-eyed boy who loved horses and mountains and following his father everywhere. Frank continued working at the Running R, eventually becoming the ranch foreman when the previous foreman retired. Katherine's sewing business flourished as Thomas got older and required less constant attention, and she gained a reputation throughout the region for the quality of her work. When Thomas was 4, Katherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose Marion, after the wildflowers Frank loved and Katherine's mother. Rose was different from Thomas in every way: quiet where he was boisterous, thoughtful where he was impulsive, content to sit and observe where he needed to be constantly moving. But the 2 children adored each other, and watching them play together filled Katherine with a contentment she had never imagined possible. The town continued to grow and change around them. New people arrived seeking their fortunes in the silver mines, and new businesses opened to serve the expanding population. The railroad finally reached Georgetown in 1884, connecting the mountain town to Denver and the wider world. Frank and Katherine watched these changes with mixed feelings, grateful for the prosperity they brought but nostalgic for the quieter, simpler town they had known. Mayor Holbrook, released from jail after serving her sentence, had moved away in disgrace, and no one knew what had become of her. Harold Holbrook had remarried and left politics, becoming just another businessman trying to make a living. Life moved on, as it always did, and the scandal that had once consumed the town faded into memory, replaced by newer dramas and newer stories. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Katherine back to the Alpine Meadow, where he had first told her he loved her. They left the children with Sarah Chen, who had become something like a grandmother to Thomas and Rose, and spent the day reliving old memories and making new ones. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked as they lay in the grass, watching clouds drift by. "Staying here, marrying me, building this life. Do you ever wonder what might have been if you had gone somewhere else, met someone else?" "Never," Katherine said firmly. She rolled onto her side to look at him, taking in the face she knew better than her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the scar on his cheekbone that she had kissed 1,000 times. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be. With you, with our children, in this place that has become home. I would not change a single thing. Not even the part where you were falsely accused of theft by a jealous woman," Frank asked with a small smile. "Not even that," Katherine said. "Because if Mayor Holbrook had not tried to ruin my life, you never would have stepped forward to defend me. We might have gone on as strangers, passing each other on the street without ever truly seeing each other. So in a strange way, I am almost grateful to her. She brought us together." "I prefer to think we would have found each other eventually," Frank said. "I was already halfway in love with you before the whole brooch incident. I just needed an excuse to talk to you." "Well, I am glad you found one," Katherine said, leaning in to kiss him. Even if it was a rather dramatic excuse. They made love in the meadow that afternoon, surrounded by wildflowers and mountains and endless sky, and Katherine felt the same rush of joy and connection she had felt the first time Frank had touched her. 10 years of marriage had not dimmed the passion between them. If anything, it had deepened it, adding layers of trust and understanding and shared history to the physical attraction. As they dressed and packed up their picnic, Katherine spotted something glinting in the grass near the creek. She walked over and picked it up, a small piece of silver, twisted and tarnished with age. It was about the size and shape of her mother's brooch, and for a moment Katherine's breath caught. But no, it was just a piece of metal, probably dropped by some miner or traveler years ago. Still, she slipped it into her pocket, a small memento of this perfect day. "What did you find?" Frank asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Nothing important," Katherine said, leaning back against him. "Just a reminder that sometimes the things we think we have lost find their way back to us in unexpected ways." "Like love," Frank said softly. "Like love," Katherine agreed. They returned home as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink and purple. Thomas and Rose ran out to greet them, full of stories about their day with Miss Chen, and Frank scooped them both up, one in each arm, making them shriek with laughter. Katherine stood on the porch of their little house and watched her family, her heart overflowing. She thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, scared and alone, falsely accused and certain her life was over. She thought about the man who had stepped forward when she had no one, who had offered his faith and his protection, and eventually his love. She thought about everything that had happened since the trials and triumphs, the ordinary days and extraordinary moments, the slow building of a life worth living. "Thank you," she whispered to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had brought Frank Rawlins into her life. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Frank and Katherine sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song. "Do you think we will grow old here?" Katherine asked, her head resting on Frank's shoulder. "In this house, in this town, with these mountains watching over us?" "I hope so," Frank said. "I cannot imagine anywhere else I would rather be." "Me neither," Katherine said. And she meant it with every fiber of her being. The years continued to unfold, bringing new joys and new challenges. Thomas grew into a young man who shared his father's love of ranching and his mother's sense of justice. He apprenticed at the running R under Frank's guidance, learning the skills that would eventually make him a fine cattleman in his own right. Rose proved to have her mother's talent for sewing and design, and by the time she was 16, she was creating dresses that were sought after throughout the region. Katherine and Frank grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They buried friends and welcomed grandchildren, weathered economic downturns and celebrated community triumphs. They added rooms to their house as their family expanded, and the little cabin that had once been cramped with just the two of them became a warm, welcoming home that was often filled with children and laughter. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town of Georgetown threw them a party in the church hall. It seemed like everyone they had ever known was their neighbors and friends, fellow ranchers and townspeople, even Judge Harrison, now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack. People stood up and gave speeches about the couple who had become pillars of the community, about Katherine's kindness and skill and Frank's integrity and hard work. But the speech that moved Katherine most was the one given by Sarah Chen, now in her 70s but still vital and engaged with the world. 25 years ago, Sarah said in her accented English, a young woman was falsely accused and alone. And a young man who had every reason to stay silent chose to speak up instead. That moment of courage changed 2 lives, but it also changed this town. It reminded us that justice matters, that truth matters, that standing up for what is right matters even when it is hard. Katherine and Frank, you have shown us what love looks like, not the easy, shiny love of fairy tales, but the real, enduring love that chooses to show up every day, through good times and bad. Thank you for being an example to all of us. Katherine wept openly, and Frank held her hand tightly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. They danced together that night, swaying slowly to music played by local musicians, and Katherine marveled at how far they had come from that terrible day in the general store when her world had seemed to be ending. "I love you," she whispered in Frank's ear. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that." "And I love you," Frank replied. "Forever, Katherine, just like I promised." They lived to see their grandchildren grow and thrive. Thomas married a rancher's daughter and took over management of the running R when Frank finally retired in his late 60s. Rose married a young lawyer from Denver, but chose to stay in Georgetown, where she opened her own dress shop that became famous throughout Colorado. Katherine and Frank's house was always full of visitors' children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, a legacy of love that stretched into the future. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Katherine holding his hand. She grieved him deeply but without bitterness, knowing that they had been blessed with a life together that most people only dreamed of. At his funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Colorado, Katherine stood and spoke about the man who had changed her life. "Frank Rawlins was a man of courage," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. He stood up for a stranger when no one else would. He loved fiercely and without reservation. He built a life of meaning and purpose, and he taught me that it is never too late to start over, never too late to choose hope over despair. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will also be grateful every day that I was lucky enough to love him and be loved by him. She scattered his ashes in the alpine meadow that had been their special place, and she felt his presence there as surely as she had felt it when he was alive. The mountains stood eternal, the wildflowers bloomed as they always had, and the wind carried whispers of love and memory across the high country. Katherine lived another 12 years after Frank's death, spending her days surrounded by family and maintaining the sewing business that had always brought her joy. She never remarried, content with her memories and the knowledge that she had experienced a love most people only read about in books. On a warm September afternoon, exactly 50 years after her wedding day, Katherine Brennan Rawlins passed away quietly in her sleep, a smile on her face. Her children and grandchildren laid her to rest beside Frank in the Georgetown cemetery, on a hillside with a view of the mountains they had both loved so much. The inscription on their shared headstone was simple: Katherine and Frank Rawlins. They stood for each other. They stood for love. And in the years that followed, when people in Georgetown told stories about the town's history, they always included the tale of the seamstress who was falsely accused and the cowboy who defended her. The story became legend, embellished and romanticized with each retelling, but at its core it remained true to what had actually happened. A man had seen an injustice and refused to stay silent. A woman had faced adversity and emerged stronger. And together, they had built a love that lasted a lifetime and inspired a community. It was a story about courage and redemption, about second chances and the power of standing up for what was right. But most of all, it was a story about love, the kind of love that transforms lives, that creates families, that leaves a legacy stretching far into the future. The kind of love that begins with a single choice to stand for someone when they have no one else. The kind of love that Katherine and Frank Rawlins had found in each other on a terrible day in 1878, in a general store in Georgetown, Colorado, when the world seemed dark but hope was waiting just around the corner. Their great-grandchildren still lived in the area, carrying on the traditions and values that Katherine and Frank had instilled in their family. The house where they had raised their children was preserved as a local landmark, a reminder of the ordinary people who had lived extraordinary lives through the simple act of loving each other well. And sometimes, on clear mountain nights when the stars were particularly bright, people claimed they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the alpine meadows above Georgetown, a tall man and a slender woman, forever young, forever in love, forever home in the mountains that had witnessed their story. It was just a tale, of course, the kind of romantic legend that mountain towns loved to tell. But those who had known Katherine and Frank, who had seen the way they looked at each other even after 50 years of marriage, who had witnessed the depth of their commitment and the strength of their love, those people liked to think there might be some truth to it. Because some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. Some loves echo through generations, inspiring and uplifting everyone they touch. Some loves become the stuff of legend not because they are fictional, but because they are so profoundly real that they transcend the ordinary boundaries of human experience. Katherine and Frank's love was like that. It had started with a simple act of courage, one man refusing to let an innocent woman be destroyed by lies. It had grown into a partnership that weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. And it had created a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. In the end, That was what mattered. Not the wealth they had accumulated or the status they had achieved, but the lives they had touched and the love they had shared. They had stood for each other in every sense of the word, defending each other, supporting each other, choosing each other day after day, year after year, until death finally parted them. And even then, in the hearts and memories of those who loved them, they stood together still. Forever united, forever remembered, forever proof that one moment of courage, one choice to stand for what is right, can change everything. The Wild West was a hard place, full of violence and injustice and cruelty. But it was also a place where courage mattered, where character counted, where ordinary people could rise to extraordinary circumstances and create something beautiful out of chaos. Katherine Brennan had come to Georgetown broken and alone, seeking nothing more than a fresh start and a chance to survive. She had found those things, yes, but she had also found so much more. She had found justice when injustice threatened to destroy her. She had found friendship in a community that rallied around her. She had found purpose in her work and joy in her family. But most importantly, she had found love, true, deep, abiding love with a man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had defended her when she was defenseless, who had chosen her when she had no one. Frank Rawlins had been drifting through life, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home, never letting himself care too deeply for fear of loss. He had been haunted by past regrets and convinced that he was destined to be alone. But then he had seen a woman in trouble, and something in him had refused to let her face it alone. That single decision had changed everything. He had found in Katherine not just a wife but a partner, a best friend, a soulmate. She had given him the home he had been searching for without even knowing he needed it. She had given him children and grandchildren, a legacy that would outlive them both. She had given him a life of meaning and purpose and deep, abiding contentment. They had been lucky. Yes, lucky that their love had been mutual, lucky that circumstances had allowed them to build a life together, lucky that they had been blessed with health and family and enough prosperity to be comfortable. But luck was only part of the story. The rest was choice, the choice to stand for each other, the choice to work through difficulties rather than running from them, the choice to love even when love was hard. And that was the real message of their story, the lesson that echoed down through the generations of their descendants. Love is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose, something you build, something you nurture and protect and refuse to let die no matter what obstacles life throws in your way. Katherine and Frank had chosen each other on that day in the general store, and they had kept choosing each other every day afterward. Through poverty and prosperity, through sickness and health, through joy and sorrow, they had stood together. They had been each other's greatest champions and most steadfast supporters. They had created a love story for the ages not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And in Georgetown, Colorado, high in the Rocky Mountains where the air was thin and the sky was vast, and the peaks stood eternal against the horizon, that love story lived on. In the memories of those who had known them. In the lives of their descendants who carried their names and their values forward into new generations. In the little house that had sheltered their family, and the meadow where they had pledged their love. The Wild West had given Katherine and Frank many things: hardship and opportunity, danger and beauty, loss and redemption. But the greatest gift it had given them was each other. And in the end, that had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Their story was one of thousands that unfolded across the American frontier in those hard, beautiful years when the West was still being tamed, and towns were being built, and people were trying to create lives worth living in an unforgiving land. Most of those stories were never recorded, never remembered beyond a generation or two. But Katherine and Frank's story endured because it spoke to something universal and timeless: the power of one person to make a difference, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the transformative force of true love. They had lived, they had loved, and they had left the world better than they found it. What more could any person hope for? What greater legacy could anyone leave behind? As the sun set over Georgetown that evening, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the town settled into its evening routine: families gathering for dinner, children playing in the streets, couples walking hand in hand through the fading light. Life went on, as it always did, each generation building on the foundations laid by those who came before. And somewhere in the eternal mountains, in the place where earth met sky and time seemed to stand still, two souls were reunited at last, their love unbroken by death, their bond undiminished by the years. They walked together through meadows of wildflowers, under stars that blazed with impossible brilliance, forever young, forever in love, forever home. It was a fitting end to a beautiful story. And though the telling was done, the legacy lived on in every act of courage, in every choice to stand for justice, in every love that refused to give up in the face of adversity. Katherine and Frank had shown what was possible when two people found each other and chose to build something lasting. Their example would inspire countless others in the years to come, a reminder that even in the hardest times, love could triumph, hope could prevail, and one person's courage could change everything. The Wild West was gone now, disappeared into history and legend. But the values it had forged: courage, resilience, loyalty, love, those endured. And in Georgetown, Colorado, in the mountains that had witnessed it all, the spirit of Katherine and Frank Rawlins lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love and the eternal importance of standing up for what is right. Their story was complete. Their lives had been lived fully and well. And though they were gone, they would never be forgotten. They had stood for each other, and in doing so, they had created something that would outlast them both: a love story that would be told and retold, inspiring and uplifting everyone who heard it, for generations to come. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift they could have left behind. Not wealth or status or material possessions, but a reminder that love matters, that courage matters, that choosing to stand for someone when they have no one else can change not just their life, but your own. That was the legacy of Katherine Brennan and Frank Rawlins, and it was a legacy worth remembering.